There we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another TLC conversation. I went back and counted, and this isn't 5 years number here, but this is the number, the 30th session that we've recorded since I joined Search Discovery 2.5 years ago. So I decided to start keeping the numbers on our slide so we can all keep track of where we are and where we've been. So welcome. Thanks for coming. Reminder to everybody, keep your lines on mute unless you have a question to ask. Use the TLC Slack. You can use the TLC calls channel or the Zoom chat if you want to ask Val any questions. And today we have Val here with us, and she's going to talk to us about presenting results that drive action. Before I introduce her with a little bit more detail, just want to remind everybody about the TLC YouTube channel, that this has all of our previous recordings, including the live session that we did at the DA Hub this year that has the entire session broken down into 10 chunks, so it's a little bit easier to consume. So feel free, check them out anytime. Of course, you can subscribe. And if you have friends or coworkers that aren't friends that you want to invite to the TLC and get them a little education, right up here in the top where it says Code of Conduct, they can click that link and sign the Code of Conduct and then get invited to future calls and to the TLC Slack. So let's get going. Let's meet Val. Val is currently Director of Optimization at Search Discovery and the President of the Board for the DAA. She built and led the Optimization and Analytics programs at the American Medical Association and UBS. She's frequently rated as a top presenter at industry conference, and despite her love of pink and lack of nerd cred, yep, we still love her. Just don't try to talk to her about Star Wars. You can actually ask her about anything related to optimization and be wowed by her brilliance, but don't ask her about any movie that happened in the last 20 years. Is that about accurate? Did I miss anything?
Very true. I'm always in the friend group that's never seen that movie. So
that is definitely Val. I haven't seen that. What do you mean you haven't seen that? All right, I'm gonna stop share and let you take over the presentation.
Sounds good. Let's see if I can get this. All right, can you see screen okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. Whoops. Awesome. I'm doing my new little clicker today, so let's see how this all works out. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kelly. Super excited to be here on the TLC chatting with all of you. So this is a presentation, or this content is usually something I present, but I really want to keep this conversation today because it is the TLC. So I'll be taking several moments to pause throughout to ask for feedback and for Kelly to ask some of the questions. So don't wait till the end because I would love to go back to the slides and tackle it since we have an hour together. And so Kelly did an introduction on some of my optimization background, but I also want to tell you a little bit about myself. As Kelly said, pink has been a big part of my life, and this was actually a dance recital photo. And after this dance recital, I was really upset with my mom that this didn't make it into my normal wardrobe because I wanted to wear this to school, to the grocery store, and she usually said it wasn't appropriate, which is a shame because it's cute. But later this year, I actually asked Santa for a Palm Pilot, a label maker, and a Franklin planner. So even though I can't nerd out on Marvel stuff, like, you know, this has made sense for a long time.
Pink Franklin planner.
Very true. And my Palm Pilot case, which I did get, was also pink. What I put in there as a 4th grader, who knows, but I loved playing with the graffiti, so. All right, so I would like to start talking today with the story, and maybe this will be something that you guys can relate to. Taking you back to the beginning of my CRO career when I was at the American Medical Association, back to the first time that experimentation was playing a major role in a large strategic initiative. So on the American Medical Association website, we had 20,000 downloadable assets for either physicians, students, or patients. And we wanted to encourage account creation and login, so we free-walled all that content. And we obviously expected the downloads to drop off, but not nearly as much as it did. It was just over 80% drop off in our downloadable assets. And since we are an association that wants to make these materials available to our constituents and our different persona groups, that was too big of a pill to swallow. So experimentation, the goal of it was to dig us out of this hole, to try to encourage people to create an account and to log in to receive those assets. So I was really excited that we had a seat at this table and we were a part of it, because with all of this new workflows and the interstitials to get people to authenticate, it was a nightmare to get any of these tests live. It was like glue sticks and bubble gum and elbow grease and all of that, which I know you guys have been through as well. But I was ultra excited to get to this presentation in front of the Digital Strategy Working Group, because one of the 3 tests we ran actually did make a significant impact on account creation. So I'm in the presentation and I start presenting the first test that actually was one of the ones that didn't have a winner, and the audience started to question my results. So I took this as a cue to have a little educational moment and talk about significant differences and confidence intervals. And before you knew it, I was up at the whiteboard, drawing all out like a crazy person. But if we were to go back and review the tapes to pinpoint the exact moment I lost my audience, it was probably right after I drew that first normal curve. So here's what the room looked like now. So the marketers who were originally questioning my results were having a sidebar conversation over here on the side, and the C-suite executives were in their BlackBerries, definitely not paying attention to me or anything I was saying. And the UX designer was sitting in the back with this smug look on his face and his arms crossed, because he told us this was never going to work anyways. Gotta love Ben. But before I had a chance to regain control of the room and talk about the test that was a winner, so we could have our slow-mo high five moment and talk about what we were going to do because of it, the meeting was over. That was it. Everyone was walking out. And as the COO passed me, he said, you're telling me all about how to make the watch, but I just want to know what time it is. And that was a major light bulb moment for me in my career as an analyst and within optimization, because I realized I had been approaching this all wrong. I had been coming to these meetings and telling my story as a CRO and walking everyone through the linear life of each of these tests, but that wasn't the message that my audience came to hear. They were desperate for some new information that was going to dig us out of this hole so we could make some more better decisions that were informed by data. And when my audience started to question my results, it wasn't because they didn't trust me. It wasn't because they didn't understand statistics, nor did they want to, but they were dealing with an inconvenient truth. I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that the marketer who originally had that question was the one who came up with that first idea I was presenting. So he was just dealing with a little cognitive dissonance, right? So after 5 years of some trial and error and really refining and thinking about how to craft a message that inspires action, I've come up with this template formula, and I'm super excited to walk you through that and have a conversation about it today. So first we're going to talk through the approach, how you think about this template. Then we're going to walk through it with an example. We're going to talk about some reasons about why you would flex this. And at the end, there'll be a link to download the template, and then we'll have additional time for Q&A at the end. So when I sit down to put together the presentation, I like to think about the end state. What do I want my audience to walk away with? What are the things, the buzz of the room, the things that they're saying as they're leaving the room? So here are some things people could say as they leave the room. Wow, I can't believe I went my whole life without knowing what a p-value was. Whew. Or, now that I attended that training on how to become a CRO, I wonder if I should update my LinkedIn. Okay, so no, these are not the things we want people saying as they're leaving our presentation. So let's contrast that with some ideal takeaways, in my opinion. Wow, I totally thought that that was gonna win. Can you imagine if we had just rolled out with that? Wow, yikes. Or even better, we should really invite XYZ person or this team to these presentations and these conversations next time, because they would get so much out of participating. So with this in mind, I would argue that these are the only 5 things you need in your presentations. So the template is, why we tested, what was tested, the outcomes, learnings, and the actions. And you'll notice there is no time reserved for education. And that's not because education isn't important, but it doesn't belong in your presentations where you're trying to inspire action out of your stakeholders. So before we jump into the template, I just want to pause and ask, like, does anyone have experiences like that? Does that resonate? Have you had any of those moments where you went in and you were super psyched and then it was like, nope, sorry, not what we came here for? I'm seeing some yeses in the comments. Kelly, have there been any questions that have come in over?
Corey gave an example. Are you on, Corey? Let me speak for you. I'm going to speak for you because you didn't take yourself off mute fast enough. It's all your fault. Yeah, Corey said in an actual CRO meeting, he had someone say, that data doesn't feel true to me. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, people's guts are really powerful, right? Like, especially if you're trying to convince them of something that like they've had a prior belief to be like the opposite of. Yeah, data can be really powerful in that way, but also like kind of confusing at times to people who aren't as familiar with it and what you can do with it.
Yep.
I love that there's some like sharing over here in the Zoom chat. I feel like this is like cathartic group therapy.
Yeah. Leading indicators before reaching sample size was perfectly okay. Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, you want me to continue on, Kelly, into diving into the template?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay.
I will pause you if folks have questions.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to walk through the template, and the way that this next section is structured is I'm going to talk a little bit about what belongs in that template or that slide, and then we're going to jump into a fake test example that we never ran on the Search Discovery website, and we'll bounce back and forth between the two. But again, I'm not presenting on stage here, so please jump in anytime.
Yep.
Okay, so first things first is you want to lay out your business case. What opportunity are we taking advantage of here? Why are we even running this test or this experiment? So some details that you might include here are where you tested this, any of those relevant audience segments, and ideally some evidence that you've gathered or captured that says that this is the perfect opportunity to be taking advantage of right now. So in our fake test example, we deployed a new chatbot on the Search Discovery website to capture leads. And management is a little disappointed in results so far. They totally thought it was going to pay for itself in the first month, probably because they were oversold during the sales process, but we'll leave that out of here for now. But some evidence that we captured is when we look at the heat maps and the session replays, we can see that people are paying attention to that part of the site when it pops up. They're just choosing not to engage with it. So before we consider this a poor source of lead capture, what if we played with that question copy to see if we could get people to take that next step? So next, we're going to lay out the thesis. So now that your base case is established, what is the primary research question that you're trying to answer with this test or this experiment? And I like to call this and frame it as like the diet hypothesis statement because it's really concise and it's accessible. So sometimes that full-blown one can scare people away, especially if you label it hypothesis. So let's just keep this simple with a nice, concise question. And we're also going to include visuals here to make it clear what we're testing. So on our fake test example, our primary research question is, will a value prop chat prompt an increase in lead capture? And we have the control and the challenger clearly labeled, and you can see from the images that are nice and big that the question is what's different. And the reason I like to include imagery this early in the presentation is it roots people in something very familiar. So maybe not all of your stakeholders in the room were a part of this test in particular, or maybe they're newer to the idea of experimentation overall. You can kind of let them follow along because they're like, okay, that chat, I've seen that on our site. I can see that those two questions are different, and they can kind of follow along with your story a little better. So now we're going to define how the experiment was measured. What was the definition of success? Now, obviously, this was determined long before you launched your experiment on your website, but this is a really good reminder to tell your audience what ruler was used in deciding what we're going to do with these results now that it's closed in field. So here's where we do get into that full-blown hypothesis statement, so that off the back of that, we can say what our primary success metric was, the primary KPI, as well as the supporting metrics that we use to help create that definition of success. So in our fake test example, we have this hypothesis statement, and I'm a huge fan of the if, then, because hypothesis framework. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I won't dig into it right now. Kelly, that might be another future conversation for the TLC.
Considering all the debates we've had recently, yeah, I think hypothesis formulation is not a bad one.
That'd be a good conversation. I have some people in mind I would love to participate in that chat with. But one of the many reasons I love this framework for this type of test is because the way it's structured is you say if, and then you describe your alternate variation or variations, then, and then that's where you talk about the primary KPI impact and where you expected it to move. And then because is like your rationale, your evidence, or like the reason. So it's really easy to pull the success metrics straight from the then statement of your hypothesis. Again, it keeps it really clear and really focused, because obviously we want to use one metric for that t-test, and then supporting metrics are the everything else we're using to analyze. And this is going to be the only area where I suggest we do a little bit of showing our work, just so that people know we're not just using lead capture rate and we're going to ignore everything else, because obviously there's probably some cannibalization analysis or some downstream impact that needs to be analyzed. So here's where we're just going to kind of say, like, here's what we looked at, and this is how we're going to define success. So now I like to take a pause from the presentation to have a little interactive moment. And so some people might think this is silly, but I have a good reason for it, so just kind of hang on. I like to ask my audience live in the room or perhaps beforehand, which variation do you think will win? And so if you use like Outlook voting buttons, or maybe you did like tallies on a dry erase board by your desk or something and had that from beforehand, then you can pop that into the screen. So even though this is kind of a silly exercise, 2 reasons I like doing it. Number 1, I have done this since the first test I ever ran on the American Medical Association website, and to date, I kid you not, the majority has never won or voted for the winning variation. And that is such an amazing point to evangelize the power of testing, because imagine if we had gone with our collective gut, we could have really damaged our business. So that's a great thing to keep track of, and to always push forward or push out externally, up and down, on the power of testing. And the second is it's a really good interactive moment with your audience. So up until this point, you've been talking to your stakeholders, your audience stakeholders. And now we're saying, like, let's try to encourage a little conversation here. So if I'm asking you, marketer, or you, product person, which variation do you think will win, you'll have to think to yourself, is there any other pieces of information I would need in order to answer that question? And you can have that little conversation before you're ever showing them any of the results. So if someone said, well, did that run at the same time as XYZ campaign, or, you know, who's the person who approved this, or whatever? You can have that conversation, and it's not about the results, it's about the test setup. So I highly recommend having that little interactive moment. But then after that, it's time for the big reveal and talking about results and what happened. And I like to break this into 2 separate sections. The first is really focused on the primary KPI, and then we'll get into everything else afterwards. So out of all the slides in this template that I'm encouraging you to take back and edit to fit for your organization, this is the one I'm most prescriptive about. And so there's 3 pieces to this one. First is going to be a single visualization that shows the impact on the primary KPI. You're going to summarize that outcome in the headline, and then at the bottom, you're going to translate that to something meaningful to your audience, ideally the business impact. So here's what that looks like. So in our fake test example, we had a winner. So we can see that we're using color to show that winner and tying that to the headline. The control challenger is still very clear to identify, and we know that we're looking at the primary KPI. And at the bottom is the business impact. So 1.9% conversion or a 58% lift is really meaningful to an analyst or a CRO audience, but it might not resonate as much with your marketers or your product team. But you want to know what language they do speak? More leads. So as best you can, try to translate that to the estimated business impact. And I know that there's a ton of ways to approach this, and it's definitely not one size fits all. And it's not an exact science, as we all know on this call. So make sure that you're not like, letting your stakeholder audience run with scissors, but like if you can extrapolate that out with your decay rate, or perhaps you produce this in a range, whatever you can do to translate the statistics of the test to something that means something to your audience, that's how you're going to really start to get them really jazzed up and excited about what you identified with this experiment.
So is running with scissors equivalent to, say, putting this in a P&L?
Yeah, I'm not going to recommend we put 840 leads into the P&L. Great call out. Are there any other questions, Kelly, on this, or do you want me to run through the last 2 slides in the template and then we can pause?
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so now we just established the impact on the primary KPI, and now we're going to talk about the everything else, and all the secondary KPIs as a part of our definition of success. But the key point here is we're only going to talk about this in the presentation if it matters, if something popped, if something is adding to our story. This is not the time to take every single metric that we use as a part of our analysis and show it in a table by A and B and pop that into PowerPoint, because remember, we're trying to build a story here. And that's not a part of this story. So
shame. I know some of you use these tables a lot.
Again, there's a time and a place, but it's not in this presentation.
Not here.
So jumping back into our fake test example, one of the things we noticed was that desktop and mobile had varying behavior for the chatbot closes. And so this will play a role in what we do about this on the back end. So that's why we included it here. Now last in our template is the learnings and actions. And so as we all know on this call, as we've all learned from Kelly's panels in the past, we learn something about a test regardless of the outcome. And so it is up to you as the CRO to summarize those learnings and tie them to actions to serve up to your stakeholders of things they can do about it. So what are we going to do now that we know? So I like to show the learnings and actions side by side so you can see how each learning is tied to a specific outcome or action. So in our fake test example, we learned that the value prop messaging resonated and increased the interest in starting a relationship. So we're going to roll out that new challenger. It's our new control to beat, and we're going to record that in our learning library. We also learned that mobile visitors didn't respond the same as desktop. And so an action there is to partner up with UX and maybe do some usability tests to figure out, are these the way that people are treating the chat so different on mobile and desktop that we should not consider this one size fits all, that we really truly should create a branch by device type, because that would change the way we optimize these opportunities, right? And also that the changes to the chatbot question did cause a change in user behavior. So any pieces of evidence that we have in our backlog hypothesis library that are relating to the chatbot, maybe we can bump up the quality of that evidence now that we have this new learning. And also, when you're thinking about the agenda of the time that you're spending with your audience stakeholders of each of these slides in this template, plan on putting this slide up and spending 40 to 50% of your time with this slide as the backdrop, because this is where the rubber meets the road. So after each learning and action, pause and see if there's other people who want to either build on a learning, maybe they saw something in that you didn't exactly see, or even better, they come up with another action because of one of those learnings, because maybe they have additional context because of their role that you don't have that can further the legs of what you've learned. I also have found in the past that this is a great place to end up with new test ideas. So maybe even have up open on another screen your hypothesis library or a backlog to capture the great conversation as you're all processing this together live. So before we pause for the questions, I just really quickly want to say we should talk a little bit about what didn't make it into the template. And this might be where you are furiously typing in the TLC Slack, because I didn't say things like
check 1 2 2 1 2 1 2.
I got it. Okay, go
I was
ahead.
going to respond back with the 3 4. So I didn't say things like statistical significance levels. We didn't show screenshots of how the variation looked across all the different device types, and there's no screenshots from your native tools. And the reason for that is because that's what an appendix is for. This is where you leverage an appendix. One thing to keep in mind even if you don't end up using this template, it will not be offended. One thing to keep in mind is, again, we're building a story and a narrative that's attempting to inspire action of our audience stakeholders. So use this lens. If it's not adding to your presentation, it's detracting from it. It's absolutely taking away. So if people only remember things in 3s or 7s, there's all that psychology that was, even going around the search discovery Slack lately. If you think about the main points you want someone to walk away with, I guarantee you it's the things on the learnings and action slide, and not whether it was 90 or 95%, right? But I do have a hypothesis for why we're so tempted to put some of this information in the slides, and it's because as CROs, we wear a lot of hats. So we're the statistician, we're the change agent, we write a lot of copy. I know I personally have felt like a hostage negotiator over the homepage hero, or what order of items are in the navigation, and air traffic control, like keeping track of like when that new direct mail piece launched, when that SEM campaign wrapped up. These are all things we need to keep in mind to run tests that are valid and have repeatable results that lead to long-lasting business impact. But one thing to keep in mind is if it doesn't matter how hard your test was to get out the door or how cool your analysis was, if you can inspire action amongst your audience, doesn't matter. It's like if a tree fell in a forest, right? So try to keep that in mind. And then also there's some benefits of having a predictable template. So the first is that your audience expectations are set. So they know what you're going to cover when you get to these meetings. Because ideally you're not sharing these slides beforehand because again, you're the presentation and that conversation is valuable to have in person. But if they know if they do have a question about what that looked like on a tablet or if they want to see that table, they know you can bookmark, jump into the appendix to answer that question and then come back to your story. So they can feel comfortable with that. Also, just in terms of operational and logistics, it's easier for you to automate your process. So there's some things that you can pre-build, or maybe you can change the way you capture information in your test plan so that you can just copy paste direct into the slides. And so there's less work and shorter time to delivery of insights. And lastly, this follows a classic storytelling arc. So first, the setting of the stage, the building of the tension, the climax, the following action and resolution. We can plot the 5 pieces of this template exactly on that curve. And some other things you could plot on this curve are classic literature and Disney movies. Our brains are like pre-wired.
Marvel,
like
Star
that.
Wars.
Oh no, I don't think those. No,
I'm pretty sure.
So our brains are pre-wired to hear like this, so let's just keep it easy. So next we're going to talk about some reasons why we would flex it, the template. So now that I've walked through all that, do we want to do a quick pause to have a little conversation? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Corey asked what I think is a really good question, which is when you're talking about the learnings, I think there's 1 or 2 slides before you said don't include anything that doesn't pop, or maybe in the earlier. And Corey was pointing out, what if the learnings aren't based on the analysis, but rather based on maybe process improvements, or something that you learned about how to set up the test in a particular development way so that you can, that sort of thing. Look, she's got the eyebrow up. She totally agrees.
Eyebrow up. Totally agree. Totally agree. And I think this even came up when we were having some of this conversation at DAA1 conference. The whole what we learned about the test, especially on a process level. I love the idea of like marketing retrospectives or optimization retrospectives. And so not only is that like, what are we going to do next now that this variation won, trying to keep people from using your testing tool as a CMS and those types of conversations, but like what we could do to make sure that the tracks are greased for next time. I love that. Totally.
Christina is asking a question that I've gotten more than once from different clients. We've had C-level members suggest showing how the winner compares to the other variations, as opposed to only showing how they compare to the control. And obviously, there's some statistical considerations in there, but what thoughts do you have about that in the results?
So again, I think that goes back to the definition of success and how you're measuring the test. So if you were having these conversations with stakeholders on the front end and you started to hear those little inklings of I want to compare C to D, and they're not just back to control, well, that would change your experimentation design. So obviously it's better to flesh those things out before you launch the test, but on the back end, if that's not possible, I think that's what reminding everyone what we could get out of this test is good, because you're like, here's what you can expect, and then here it is. And so if they're disappointed in that, I think that's a good conversation to say, why you can't get into that as non-geeky optimization statistics language as possible. You can just say, the methodology and the way we deployed this didn't support that type of analysis. But if that's really critical and important to our next steps, potentially we can run another test, or I don't know what the exact constraints are of this fake example, but as best you can, try to preserve, the way, the spirit of the test and the way you launched it, because it was for a reason, right? And there's obviously trade-offs that you're aware of that your stakeholders might not be. So as best you can, try to not get into it in that meeting, but potentially bring that up the next time you're having the design meeting where you're talking about why we're running the test on the front end.
Before I get to Olga's question, I just want to reiterate or ask you to speak a little bit more about a couple of different times you've said, of course, that's a decision we make before we launch the test. Can you speak to how much easier this template and presentation story becomes if you've done that pre-work? And what does that look like? And what kind of pre-work, and who do you include in sharing the plan?
Totally. So I think that there's regardless of how you do this, there's probably two different levels. I could probably summarize it in two different levels. So there's one with the people who roll up their sleeves and are getting in it with you, either the stakeholders who are taking advantage of these learnings, or who are asking you to de-risk a potential opportunity, and the people who are getting it out the door. And those people need to be in the nitty-gritty, right? And there obviously is going to be a stakeholder there, like I just described, who's going to sign off on the test plan. And that test plan shouldn't look like gobbledygook numbers and formulas to them. There should be some human readable elements of it, such as that business case up front, why are we testing this? And so that's a document that you could use for sign off. And then there's a second piece, that's the summarizing of this to the broader audience. And so potentially it's everyone in marketing, or if you have an experimentation roundtable where you get people together as a cross-functional team to talk about experimentation, if you prioritize as a group, then they should all be made aware. And so in that summary, you talk about why you're testing it, what's going to be tested, maybe even including some visuals, and then the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve, because this is a great time to ask people to vote for which variation you think will win. So I've done that, facilitated that a lot of times with blog posts, so that's preserved on the intranet, so that those details are available to people, even if they weren't part of that core group, that ideally are signing off on what you need. And to Kelly's point about how much easier it makes this whole process in the back end, I can't even tell you. It is so worth having those extra meetings or those extra conversations to nail these things down, because the worst thing that can happen in CRO, in my opinion, isn't even a test breaking. It's that you go through all of this work and you get to this presentation moment and it's not what someone expected, or it's not all that they needed. So it's really worth it to invest in those upfront conversations. And I think over time, they'll get more efficient. So I say pay it forward and have those meetings on the front end.
Okay, two more. Olga asks, do you create this type of presentation for every successful test? Thought that question was interesting because of the word successful.
Yes. So I don't put together these presentations for every single test. However, whether or not it was successful has no bearing on whether or not I decide it's worth the presentation. Because it only is 5 core slides, it isn't as arduous as putting together a 30-slide presentation that digs into every single visualization, or every stone that you unturned, that people aren't really interested in, especially if I picked up this stone, but there was nothing there. They don't care. Newsflash, they don't care. So if it is really concise, and you do get the opportunity to have this live forum, I do recommend putting this together for all the tests that you can. Obviously, if you're running a super high velocity program, it's not always possible, but think about that framework of the 5 components of this formula for whatever forum you use to communicate it. So whether that's over email, if that's a Confluence page that you use for optimization, whatever that looks like, think about that as your filter, especially if you aren't going to be present to share the narrative, to focus people in on the key pieces of that test. So
awesome. And then Lee, what about finishing these meetings where you're giving these presentations from the results? What about finishing with explicit action items to the team to be tasked with so that they really engage in the material? He wants to know, do you think that expectation is too high?
I absolutely do not. I mean, not every single action you want to assign that, but I used effective experiments back when I was at UBS, and we had 2 different statuses, which is one of the reasons why I love it more than Jira, because a test being completed and closed or finished are 2 different statuses. So completed means the test is completed, the analysis has been shared, but we never count it as closed until the actions have been taken.
Nice.
So that's a good way, and that's like what we used as a shared goal with our marketing and product teams as percentage of closed tests instead of a win rate or a certain threshold in terms of like velocity, but we were co-owning the responsibility of what we do now that we know. And so no one wanted to like leave things like undone, and so there was a lot of motivation to close that out.
That's
so I love using that.
We were having a discussion on the TLC Slack last week or the week before, and I can't remember who asked the question about different KPIs to use for program success. And we were talking about all these different rates, including, percentage of tests that led to a site change or a decision or whatever, and various different terminology. And somebody asked a follow-up question about how do you track that? And what you just described would be a perfect way if you have a flag in some system that says, action taken, or, we've actually done the thing we said we were going to do based on our results. It's really important.
Totally. Because optimization doesn't exist in a silo. Like you can't come to an organization and be like, here's some optimization and, oh, we don't need to talk to marketers. We don't need to talk to the product team. Like we could just optimize. Like that doesn't happen. Like we need to work collaboratively. And so, I mean, a huge role of CROs, in my opinion, is change management in your organization, because it wasn't a function before and now it is. It's a lever we can pull. And so it's on you to help change your organization to understand how to take advantage of everything you're learning. Otherwise, the tree fell in the forest, like I was saying before.
Awesome. Show us how to flex it.
Let's do it. All right. So if you're thinking, Val, thank you so much for showing us this template for the easiest of tests, simple A/B split. My tests are way more complicated. I'm like way more sophisticated than that. So how would you use this template in that case? So I'm going to walk through that example, but thinking back to the 5 pieces that are in this template formula, this actually might change less than you expect. So in this next fake test example, we're building on our last example of the chatbot. So in our business case, we're saying, in a prior test, we proved that the chatbot can be a good source of leads, but we have this new control, but it's likely one size fits all is the local maxima, because we know that our clients come to us with a diverse set of needs. And so what if we tried to do some like an evergreen campaign with some personalization? So the 3 most popular areas of the search discovery website are around Domo, Adobe Launch, and CRO. So the idea here is there an MVP way to test personalized messages to pop on the chatbot when people are on that content? And one quick thing to call out and see if this works. Ooh, she's fancy. The link here is to the prior test. Could you see that, the circle?
No.
No?
Oh. I'm sure you're fancy anyway.
I thought you were going to get so excited, Kelly.
I can't see it.
No. Anyways, well, up at the top, the prior test is hyperlinked, because in this case, we're going to link back to the results of the past test so that you can see that Oh, you're fancy. I love it. Just so that you can kind of keep that continuity. Now Kelly's concerned it's going to stay there forever. Oh, even better. So close to my heart. So the business case, that looks the same. And then we get, oh no, Kelly, it's staying. I'll keep going, you fix it. Perfect. So now we're going to jump into our diet hypothesis. Our primary research question: will the content-specific chats create more leads? And so now we have the control versus our challengers. And as you can see, this slide is a little bit busier. And so on the challenger slide, I've zoomed into just the question copy. So it's, again, really easy for your audience to see exactly what we're testing here. So keep tricks like that in mind. Like it could be zooming in, it could be call out boxes, arrows, whatever you need to do, especially if it's like a complex flow, to make sure that you're visually communicating what the variations are. This slide looks exactly the same. Obviously, sometimes that hypothesis framework will change up a little bit, but that's pretty much the same. Maybe you're going to include this slide because you want to take a live poll of which variation do you think won. And then we'll get into the primary KPIs. So in this fake test example, we did not have a winner. So in this case, we're using color because there's no variation of call out. The headline still summarizes those results. And then in the bottom, we're translating it to no material impact on leads captured, because you know you're going to have someone in the audience that says, well, 1.9 is higher than 1.8. And so that way you're still translating for them what this means. And I think that when it is not a winner, it actually puts even more pressure, in a way, on you to summarize what we learned from this and what we're going to do about it, because it's not going to be quite as obvious for your audience. So what we learned here is that those personalized chats didn't garner the lift we hoped, so we're going to go ahead and leave the control in field. We're not going to make any changes. Perhaps one of the ideas here is perhaps that the content chat should be used as a cross-sell instead of congruent with page content. So we're going to go back and gather some evidence and see if there's another different opportunity or way we could approach this idea. And that's pretty much what we're summarizing in this third learning down here is based on what we looked at, there might be another way of approaching this test. And again, this is like another really good way to get people comfortable with the difference between a test idea and the way that you've deployed that test, because there's obviously a lot of different ways to skin this cat, right? And so thinking about what new test ideas we could come up with, not that we're going to test them next, because they need to be put through our prioritization machine, and we can trust that that will surface the opportunities when the time is right. But this is a great way to not just like say, well, let's just like crumple it up and throw it over our shoulder. So another reason why you would flex this is if you get that super special email from senior management that they want just 2 slides to summarize that most recent test.
Or a one-slider.
Or a one-slider. Oh yeah, that's even better. But usually when you get this super special email, it's like T-4 hours until whatever said big meeting someone's presenting at. So you need to be able to put this together quickly. So here's what I'd recommend. So we're going to take that diet hypothesis, those large images, and merge it with the primary KPI results. So you have your headline, you have your large images, control, challenger clearly labeled, you have the outcomes, you have the call out, and at the bottom we're still talking about business impact. The only thing that I've added to this is that second line that says the name of the test and the dates that it ran. And the reason I'm suggesting that you include that is because if you're getting just 2 slides, it's likely going to get shoved into some larger mega deck. So this can serve as the breadcrumb between the two slides that you're submitting. And then another thing to keep in mind is leveraging the notes section. So if there's any key pieces of information that you want to make sure stays with this test, put it down there. Because there's a good chance that now that you've sent this off into the senior management email ether, that you won't be present every single time this deck is shared out. So what are some important caveats to understanding this test, or what are some reasons why this ran? Anything that you need to do to preserve the message as close as possible to the way that you would tell the story, put that down there, and we'll cross fingers that people are looking at it and that they can use it when they're telling the story.
So pro tip, if you have an analyst that is really good at producing these amazing decks, but not great at storytelling, pair them with somebody who's good at storytelling, have them go through the deck and add the story into these notes section, that then the analyst or whoever is presenting gets both sides. Because the speaker section is really important, because you're not always the one that's presenting, or you may not be great at storytelling. So find someone who is, find a buddy, don't go alone. Important.
Totally. I like that. Pro tips. And then the second slide in the 2-slide template is going to be around the learnings and the actions. But instead of doing this side by side like you would do if you were live with a screen in front of you, we're going to put it this way vertically, just because you're thinking like senior management, there might be a higher propensity for them to print said deck, and so let's lay it out this way. It works a little bit better. So again, every learning action summarized, and as best you can, use that headline space to either talk about the biggest action or the biggest learning, or perhaps summarizing everything that's contained in that slide. So we've seen a winning test result. We've seen a visualization of a test that didn't have a winner. But now the sad puppy wants to know how to present a losing test result. This is almost like too extreme, this photo, for what this is. Because don't worry, little puppy, we still learned something, even though that test lost. Don't worry. So here's what that might look like. This is back to our first test that we ran. So visually, aesthetically, this is actually going to look very similar to the test that did have a winner, because we're still going to use color. We're still going to tie that to our headline. The biggest departure is actually in the bottom. So instead of talking how many more leads this test is going to get you, now you're going to talk about how many butts you've saved by running this test in this experiment. So as best you can, again, like we talked about, I'm sure that could be a whole nother TLC, projecting business impact. But as best you can, try to summarize what we would have done damage-wise to the business if we hadn't run this experiment. Because again, that's another great proof point of the power of testing, and you never want to waste a chance to evangelize that. And again, a lot of pressure on the learnings and action slide when there is a loser, but we still want to make sure we emphasize it, still want to have a lot of great discussion on it. So if there was a loser where this didn't resonate, but it doesn't mean it's not worth exploring further, that's our learning. The action might be record that in the learning library so that we know not to touch that stove again the exact same way. But also, what are we going to do about it? Maybe we partner with marketing UX to dig into the copy some more before we draft up that new test idea to be prioritized. Another learning when you have a losing test result a lot of times is that changes to the chatbot question did cause a change in user behavior. It wasn't the outcome that you wanted or the change you expected, but it still caused a change. And so that's something you can take advantage of again in your evidence in deciding how to prioritize those next ideas in the chatbot.
Do you notice what she didn't say, everybody, when you have a losing test? What is your next step? Move on to something else. Iteration is really important.
Yeah, I mean,
you guys know that, but remind everybody else.
Tell your
friends. All hope. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so in summary, things that I want you to walk away with from this presentation. Remember that your audience doesn't come to your readout meetings because they want to learn how to do your job. They're in marketing or they're in product because that's what they chose to do with their career. So don't try to bring them to our side. And remember how to tailor a message that's appropriate for them. Also remember that your goal is to inspire action amongst your audience. So focus on what matters to them. Again, a lot of times that means telling them what time it is and not necessarily how to make the watch. And also to never waste an opportunity to evangelize the power of testing, because we all know that you're going to get into that inevitable conversation, horse trade of resources. And instead of trying to make your case then and there for why experimentation is necessary, you'll have been planting seeds with people all along, and it won't seem extra, but rather a part of the fabric of the team, the marketing team, the product team, and necessary. So don't waste those opportunities. All right, so here's a link to the template. So bit.ly TLC-templates, plural, and you can download it. It will be a PowerPoint file. And so I built out both templates that we reviewed today, the one that's the 5 slides as well as the management 2 slide. And I built it with all the Microsoft Office PowerPoint defaults so that it's really easy for you to apply your company's branding. Just grab that theme from the design ribbon. And I'll say that because it's built with all those, it's ugly, but that's just for your ease. So when you apply that in there, there's some pre-built fields and questions to help prompt you for the information that goes into each of the components. But again, don't judge me on using the defaults. So that's it. I have my LinkedIn information on there, but I'll go back to this so you can grab the bit.ly, because I know that you guys know where to find me. So.
And I put it in the Slack, but yes, let me put it in the Zoom link as well. Somebody click on that and make sure it works, that I didn't have a typo. And then as we're closing out here, we've got about 5 more minutes. If anybody has any additional questions, I'll kick us off with one while you guys think through it. But I want to go back to the what we don't include and why. I've had several recent conversations with several clients around how, if they've already started communicating certain information on a regular basis, how do they take that information out? What process do they do? Because people are sort of expecting, like you said, you've got this story arc that you're trying to teach them to follow, and there's certain information in it. What if you've been telling them stuff that now you just don't want to debate about anymore because they don't get it anyway, or it's not adding to the conversation, to your point? How would you go about taking it out?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I started to do when I was presenting at the AMA. Is we went, I mean, there was a couple iterations before we got here, trust me, but I just had to do it kind of cold turkey, and I would encourage you to test that as well, because what's the worst case scenario? You have to jump into the appendix to show it, and then it's there for a lot of the pieces that you're thinking about. But exactly what you said when you were framing up the question, Kelly, there's a pretty good chance that they didn't understand the information to begin with. So maybe we could just avoid that confrontation. You never want to make your audience feel dumb or like they don't understand something. And so if you position this all at a really accessible level, the thought process here is that you're encouraging the conversation that you want to be having. And it's not about, again, trying to have an educational moment with them and teaching them these concepts that aren't critical to their roles or their job. It's not what they're evaluated on. They don't need to understand those things. So again, I would just try pulling it out and honestly see if someone notices. And if they do, again, throw out the appendix so that you can feel calm when you walk into that presentation, that you know it's there. If you need to touch upon it, but just see, like, over time, if you can start to build new patterns and behaviors around expectations of what's going to be covered. That would be my advice.
And what about statistical significance and confidence? And so many people don't get it. And specifically, since these conversations have happened a lot recently, can you speak to how you talk to them about what confidence means and what it doesn't mean regarding the amount of the lift, and why you don't want to put it out there?
So again, if I'm having those conversations with someone who doesn't understand what that means, that's two things. One is I'm presenting to a stakeholder audience, because this isn't the template that I would use when I'm presenting to analysts. Like when I have clients that are my CRO team, this isn't what I use, right? Because they do have the capacity to get under the hood, because they are interested in those pieces of information, because it does lead to them feeling differently about the test. So if I am having that conversation about confidence and significant levels, it's because we're in a training, and I do have the time and the space to, like, pull up the diagrams and potentially even use some of those little applets to show live in that meeting how those curves change as your sample increases and things like that. So that if
you don't want to get in those conversations with the product owners and marketers.
Or if I do, it's because we've set up some time to dig into it.
But not during this result.
And they showed up, like, they came to that meeting because they're interested in it. And Eric Matisoff had an awesome point during one conference last week as well, that to call some meetings where there's education, an analytics refresher. Because if it's called Analytics 101 or Analytics Train, you're kind of saying, like, you don't know this, but I do. But if you're like refresher, because, oh, I know you already know this, but we're just going to build upon it. That's a really great framing. I loved that. So again, try to have those conversations when you could really get into it and you're prepared for that conversation and you have the resources and you've thought about that narrative, separate from the presentation of results, where you're really just trying to pare it down to what happened, what they should do about it, why they cared, and that type of message.
Awesome. I can't thank you enough, Val. This is the second or third time that I've gotten to see this. You've added a couple of new slides and a little bit more information. It was very enjoyable, as always. And of course, the recording will be live, probably loaded onto the YouTube channel sometime today, tomorrow at the latest. And I'll share it out through the Slack and through the email list for everybody who signed the code of conduct. There's a call for panels, panel topics, panelists for December and January. If anybody has any, burning topics that they would like to hear more about, or if you recently went to a conference, saw a presenter and would like us to reach out to that presenter, as we did with Val here, happy to do so. Just let me know. You can send me an email, kelly.wortham searchdiscovery.com, or through the TLC Slack or here on the Zoom. At least while it's open, I will get all of that information. And thank you guys. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Don't forget to set your clocks back for those of you in the U.S. have a great day. Have a great weekend. Thanks, Val.
Bye.